Hi, everyone. I'm Ariel Celia, behavioral scientist, recovering academic, now consulting in tobacco harm reduction. My disclosures are on the screen, but this is my personal channel and not funded or overseen by employers or clients. Today, we're going to chat with Laura Leigh Oyler, Vice President of U.S. Regulatory Affairs at Haypp Group. Laura Leigh is a strong advocate for tobacco harm reduction for people who continue to smoke cigarettes and has over 15 years of experience in the U.S. regulatory space at the local, state, and federal levels. Previously, she played a pivotal role at Philip Morris International, where she developed a new team to support U.S. regulatory activities, managing pre-market submissions to FDA and ensuring post-market compliance. She's helped shape tobacco policy, especially in the nicotine pouch and snus categories, through engagement with FDA and representation on industry boards. Laura Leigh, thanks for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
It's
So
been quite a week.
it's been quite a week. Yes, absolutely. We are going to get into all that. We're going to talk a lot about the US regulatory system since you have so much experience. I'm more coming from the science side and kind of getting up to speed on regulatory, and you know it very well. But before we get into all that, I always like to ask how people end up in this role working for the nicotine or tobacco industry. I heard a funny story from somebody that we probably both know who was sitting in an airport and somebody was overhearing their conversation and turned to them like, "You guys seem like such nice, normal people, but you work for the tobacco industry? Like, what's the deal?" So, Laura Leigh, what's your origin story?
Yes, I'm a lawyer by training. I grew up in Arkansas, and my first real job was as a juvenile prosecutor in the Arkansas County court system. And that's what I was doing when I met somebody from the industry who offered me a job to come and learn employment law. And I was at that phase in my career where I thought, why not? Why not learn something new? Why not try something different? And that's how I ended up coming to Big Tobacco, was as an employment lawyer in the HR space. And I did that for about 4 years. And the longer I was there, the more I got exposed to harm reduction principles and policies, and ended up moving over into the world of government and regulatory affairs to work more on policy because it's super interesting to me. I grew up with a lot of smokers. I'm from Arkansas, and a lot of people around me smoked when I was growing up. And I think that, determinativism is a trait that people around me prize quite a bit where I grew up. And tobacco harm reduction seems to be that middle ground, I think, for people who maybe don't want to be told what to do or how to live their lives, but would benefit from having options that they perhaps don't know about today. So it became sort of a personal cause for me at some point in the last decade and a half.
That's fascinating. And it seems like it's always kind of an accident that people end up in this kind of role. I'm curious if you had any like opposition to it at the beginning and changed your mind along the way, or were you always in favor of harm reduction?
To be honest with you, until I worked in tobacco, I'm not sure that I knew that term. Certainly, my personal politics trend towards harm reduction in a number of respects, whether that's in drug use or in sexual health. I think humans make better decisions when they have more information. And we can't make society completely risk-free. So making sure that people have options to be safer permeates across so many different industries and like parts of our lives, except for this one place. Like I'm always really struck by Democrat or liberal support for harm reduction in a number of contexts, but never in tobacco harm reduction. And so that sort of philosophical misalignment, I think, is fascinating and definitely drives me to do some of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. People deserve better information to make choices for themselves. Even if they engage in activities that we don't necessarily want them to, or that public health doesn't want them to. Um, why do you think that is, by the way, that the attitudes are going completely opposite for tobacco versus other types of harm reduction?
I think it has a lot to do with the history of the industry, with their political approach historically, kind of the political friends they've been able to make have typically been on the other side of the aisle. And so this has taken on a wild politicization but I think it's absolutely driven in large part by the history of the industry. And also, there's sort of a war, I guess, between the tobacco control folks and the industry folks. And if tobacco's doing it, it must be bad. There's just this really black and white sort of way of thinking about the industry that doesn't lend itself well to solving big problems. Um, but the moralism that I see expressed often doesn't necessarily line up with like the behaviors I've seen within these companies either. A lot of very good, smart, talented people in tobacco who generally do believe in tobacco harm reduction. And I think, when you look at the economics of it, we're talking about the cigarette, it's been declining 4.5% a year from a volume perspective since the 90s. Like,
Wow.
you can't, I think, work within this space and not recognize that the industry is fundamentally changing and that's being driven by consumer choice. So that interests me a lot, because then the question becomes, well, how do you expedite that consumer choice
Yeah.
in such a way that you see like a meaningful reduction or improvement in public health?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. So let's shift gears now to the regulatory system. And I know there's a lot of news that we have to cover from over the past week, but let's just start at the beginning for people that are not familiar with how the US regulatory system works. So, like, what does it take for an e-cigarette or a pouch to get authorization, not approval?
So if you'll indulge me, let me back up a second and talk about just nicotine as a molecule,
Sure.
because nicotine is regulated under two different centers at the FDA. One is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER. This is the branch of the government that gives us new drug approvals. Nicotine is also regulated by the Center for Tobacco Products as a consumer good. And there are two different standards at these centers. A nicotine-based product that goes through the CDER Center has to show that it is safe and effective, typically associated with a claim like helps people stop smoking, reduces cravings, something along those lines. If nicotine as a molecule is regulated on the Center for Tobacco side, it can be called neither safe nor effective, nor can a claim be made about its potential for cessation. And I think that's something that most consumers don't understand. And I think there's a lot of misperceptions around nicotine that the data shows, where people just don't understand nicotine is not the primary carcinogen in a cigarette. It is not really the major source of harm from combustible tobacco products. And the bifurcation of regulatory regimes, I think, only serves to further that confusion amongst consumers. I think actually one of your colleagues, Dr. Schiffman, did some research on this topic a few decades ago, looking at how people's misperceptions about nicotine keep them from even wanting to try like a nicotine replacement therapy product. So the misperceptions cover both sides of the FDA center, and ultimately lead to consumers being less likely to shift to a nicotine product that poses less risk of death and disease than cigarettes do. So we'll focus on the P side of things from a process perspective, because that's certainly the one I know a lot better. So in addition to never being
And
able to
before you
call
go
these,
any further, I wanted to comment on misperceptions because the bifurcation that you mentioned with how medicinal versus consumer products are regulated, that is making its way into a talking point that I see almost on a weekly basis in the literature that, oh, e-cigarettes, it's not proven that they're effective for smoking cessation and they're not authorized or approved for smoking cessation. And it's like, but they are effective for smoking cessation. It's just like they're referring to kind of a technical regulatory distinction to mislead about their effectiveness.
yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. It's definitely one of those red herring sorts of arguments that makes me pretty upset, because it does, I think, just further serve to confuse people about nicotine, confuse people about the regulatory nature of the FDA. I think most people don't know the FDA regulates nicotine and tobacco products at all, much less that there are two different ways of doing that. And yes, either the folks who write those articles don't know that there are two different centers that regulate the products, or they are choosing to intentionally mislead people by presenting the products in that way. It's like, well, of course they're not authorized for cessation. Nobody has taken an e-cigarette down that pathway. Instead, we get a clunkier, appropriate for the protection of public health that gets applied on the CTP side of things.
Yeah, definitely. And can you speak to why no e-cigarette company has gone down the cedar pathway? It's a lot more burdensome from what I understand.
It's so, gosh, it's been probably a decade since I've had one of these conversations internally. And I remember at the time that was the way people thought about it was, oh, it'll take so much longer to go through that pathway. It's going to cost so many more millions of dollars to execute the science. And of course, that's not really how things have played out with the Center for Tobacco Products. I don't know that a decade ago we would have seen authorizations for something like Zyn taking almost 5 years to get through the CTP.
Right.
Um, but at this point, I'm not sure that there's like a differential investment of time or money to get a product through as appropriate for the protection of public health as opposed to safe and effective. And I'd also say, I think a lot of consumers, a lot of people who continue to smoke, don't necessarily see themselves as patients in need of medicine or treatment, and are much more likely to accidentally quit when they try a new consumer option that they like. And then, I mean, you see these sort of anecdotal reports all the time where people say, I just noticed I hadn't had a cigarette in a couple of weeks. They accidentally quit by switching to these new products. And I think the consumer optionality and availability, across the retail shelf next to cigarettes probably does a lot of work to shift people in a way that, having to go visit a doctor, get a prescription, get it filled, may not appeal to people in the same way, especially with the state of like insurance and healthcare in this country. And when you take into account the fact that demographically speaking, the people in this country who still smoke are likely to be lower socioeconomic status, less likely to have access to things like great health plans, making sure that these consumer choices stay visible and acceptable, I think is of paramount importance.
Right. Absolutely. So can you walk us through quickly, like what does it take? What kind of studies, what kind of science to get a product like Zyn authorized?
Yeah, it takes a lot more science than I think people realize. And I love to talk about this because I think it's really important as we're dealing with these misperceptions that consumers trust the other elements of these products as well as are not confused about the nicotine in them. But yeah, the FDA has guidance for what goes into a pre-market tobacco application or PMTA, and you have to give a full chemical characterization. There's typically, chemistry analysis and toxicology that goes into these studies or that goes into these applications. Often there's an abuse liability study, which is a measure of how quickly the nicotine gets absorbed into the bloodstream. That's a clinical study. And then there are also usually behavioral studies involved as well, the kind of studies that track people over time to see how their behavior might change as they're exposed to the products or messaging around them. So they're pretty robust. If done well, they take at least a year to put together, and anywhere between 4 to 5 million to many dozens of millions, depending on the product that you're trying to get through the pathway. There are typically multiple rounds of back and forth with the agency. You file, you get accepted, you get filed for scientific review. You're going to hear from the agency more than once with additional questions before you finally get to that point of market granted order. And I haven't run the numbers in a while, but the statute that governs this says that the FDA has 180 days to make a decision once they receive an application. They have not yet met that time clock. And in some cases, like in the case of Zyn, it took almost 5 years to get that application. So I think we're also hoping that the FDA figures out how to speed things up.
Right. Yeah. So in some of the recent conferences, acting director Brett Koplow gave an update, and he was saying how over the past calendar year they got 70% of the way through the backlog, and I think now for the first time ever they have no backlog for the acceptance stage. Are you optimistic about these developments, or do you still see the need for like more, I don't know, more efforts to streamline the process?
A really good question. I was just looking at the filing statistics because with the announcement about enforcement that came out last week, it made me curious how many products are in the queue with that designation.
Right.
And the FDA hasn't updated those numbers since December of last year. And I was only looking at nicotine pouches. I was not looking at any other category. So this is the other category, which could include lozenges or other novel oral products. But in any case, it appears as though 27,000 or so applications got filed in 2025.
Wow.
So if the FDA is saying, as of now, they have somehow worked through, and that's just for the other category, they've somehow worked through that backlog and everything's gotten either an acceptance or refused to accept, that is a positive sign. I, an acceptance should be a pretty easy bar to meet, although certainly plenty of refuse to accept letters get issued every year.
Yeah.
It does make me wonder about filing status, though. How many, of those applications that make it through acceptance go on to scientific review? It's a pretty small percentage.
Hmm.
And so I think I've seen some evidence that the FDA is using AI to more quickly clear through those applications as they first come in to check, the application, the acceptance bar is pretty low in terms of what you have to have submitted in order to get accepted. The filing bar is quite high. One question I have is like, how good are the tools, the AI tools? How much
Right.
better will they get in the short term? Because I think if the FDA is able to optimize technology in such a way that more quickly lets them get through that filing phase, hopefully we'll see decisions coming out faster. But I say all of that in sort of a vacuum of appreciation for the politics that overlay apparently every decision the FDA makes in this
Right.
space.
Yeah. So you mentioned I guess let's go to this topic now. The news from last Friday is the FDA's new enforcement guidance. You alluded to that just now, but can you explain what that is and what the significance is?
Yeah, so again, let me back up just a little bit because some regulatory history here matters, I think. FDA deemed a series of new products back in 2016. The deeming rules went into effect. And after the deeming rules into effect, all these new categories of products like e-cigarettes and pouches now came under FDA's authority. And then there were a series of court cases, and all of a sudden, everybody had to have a PMTA submitted on August 8th, 2020, for all of those newly deemed products. There was, because the Tobacco Control Act specified tobacco-derived nicotine as a part of the regulatory framework, over the next 2 years, we saw a flood of innovation in the
The
synthetic nicotine
loophole, right?
space.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Congress came along and said, no, that counts too. That's FDA's business as well. And so we got a new filing date of May 14th, 2022. And so arguably, if you had a PMTA filed after that date, you were not likely to have any enforcement discretion over the continued sale of your products in the marketplace, because that 2022 date was mandated by Congress. And basically you had to have a product in the market and a PMTA filed in order to meet the requirements. So what the FDA's announcement on Friday does is sort of change our understanding of where that line for enforcement discretion comes from. Again, we were tying it kind of to a date before that, a date certain by which PMTAs were required to be filed. Now the FDA has said, well, if you have an application that's 180 days old, which has been not only accepted, but has also received that filing letter, meaning we've done a quick scan and it seems like you have all the big chunks of science we think you need.
Yeah, that
But
seems pretty major because, as you explained, the original deadlines were for companies that already had products on the market. And it was like, okay,
Mhm.
well, we'll let you keep selling them as long as you've made a good faith effort to comply with the regulation. But this is different now because it can capture new products being submitted, correct? After the 180
Yeah,
days?
it takes us beyond that May 14th date for sure.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to me because it's somewhat of a tacit acknowledgement by the agency that it cannot do what it needs to do in 180 days.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think there's some litigation implications for that. I mean, not to be a total conspiracy theorist, but just looking at this number of filings and thinking about how many refuse to accept, refuse to file. There have been a couple of court cases that have kind of touched on this issue of the 180-day time clock, but none of it's really required the judges to say FDA has to abide by this rule, right?
Hmm.
So it's somewhat protected from a litigation standpoint because it takes a claimant's argument that they're being commercially impacted by FDA's delay kind of off the table for litigation purposes.
Oh, interesting.
Because if you're selling, you're not experiencing a commercial harm from their delay, right?
Right.
It makes me wonder if more denials are coming, if more RTFs are coming that they think they're going to have to defend against.
Mm.
And so they're kind of getting rid of that 180-day statutory argument by coming up with this enforcement guidance. Now, again, all this depends on the FDA's ability to move to a filing decision in 180 days. So you can get your acceptance letter and wait 4 years maybe before you get that filing letter. And now nothing's moving much faster at all.
Right.
The FDA has also promised to keep a list of all products that are eligible. The press release makes it seem like the FDA wants companies to reach out to them and say, ooh, put us on the list.
Mm. Hmm.
Historically, the FDA has actually taken the step of calling applicants and saying, do we have your permission? Because sometimes there are commercially sensitive applications. Maybe a company doesn't want you to know that they have a delicious banana mango thing coming in a new format. And so they choose not to voluntarily put that name on the list. So any list will be voluntary and likely incomplete if that's the FDA's process for putting it together this time.
Right.
But it does at least, I think, level the playing field. I mean, as you know, I work for an online retailer and I watch the warning letters that get issued every week. They are by and large to online sellers of nicotine products that are not legal in this marketplace.
Hmm.
So I'm hopeful that this very clear guidance levels the playing field for retailers in terms of what products should be sold in this marketplace.
Hmm.
There should be less confusion if there's a public list on the topic.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And would that impact like the statewide PMTA registries?
Yeah, that's a whole other
Hopefully.
layer.
It's a whole
I mean,
nother layer.
yeah, it depends on how the registry language is drafted.
Okay.
Sometimes there's that May 14th, 2022 date in the statute. Nothing can help you if you don't have a filing by that point. Sometimes there's language that excludes products that are undergoing scientific review or have a market granted order. Those states are probably safe, but it is going to be very much a state by state assessment. And, you know, a market granted order in a state with a flavor ban does not bring that flavor back to life in that state because it's
Right,
already
right.
banned. So
Yeah.
there's a whole layer of state and then county and then local restrictions that you have to take into account when you're thinking about the impact of something like this too. But it's also, I think, a tacit acknowledgement that these products pose less harm.
Hmm.
And the FDA seems, you know, okay with this idea that we're still in a pre-market environment
Hmm.
where consumers can access these products without having a final determination met by the agency because they're reasonably sure that if you've put together all the science, it's going to be a good story. I mean, that seems
Right.
to be the implication here as well, which is exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. Yeah, and I think going back to your earlier distinction between the CEDAR drug pathway and the PMTA, it also is kind of in a way like a tacit acknowledgement that if a product is authorized, I mean, like, what is it? What are they actually saying? You can't actually claim unless you get an MRTPA, which you can talk about in a minute. You can't claim that it's safer or less exposures. You can't claim that it improves cessation, but they're weighing the benefits and it's better in some way, and it probably touches on both of those categories. So it's a weird, it's trying to make a distinction without really being a distinction there. I mean, I guess the main distinction, like you mentioned earlier, is the medical route of smoking cessation, which, like as you mentioned, people have to go to a doctor, get a prescription, or go to the pharmacy, pick up NRT, and that only is really accessible to like the 15% of adult smokers that plan to quit soon. The other 85%, they can be reached by alternative consumer products without necessarily intending to do that. So I see that as a pretty important distinction, but I don't think that's um, it's not really exactly the science going into some of the PMTA applications.
Yeah, and I think it's also a tacit acknowledgement of the FDA's impact in the marketplace. In 2018, the FDA said, oh, these flavored e-cigarette pods, we think that that is why kids are using the product. So we're going to say you can't have them in as a part of enforcement discretion, right? Like no longer applies to flavored pods. And so everyone in the market with a PMTA took their flavored pods off the shelves and complied with the FDA. And what we saw after that was 6 years of growth of an illicit flavored e-cigarette marketplace, or gosh, 8 years now of growth, whereby now some estimates say 80% of all e-cigarettes consumed in this marketplace are illicit, have not gone through FDA channels, but give people the flavor options that they really do seem to want. So consumer demand certainly drives illicit trade, and the FDA's ability to eliminate consumer demand by calling something unlawful, I think they're recognizing that that approach has limits. And so I think we're in this moment in time where if enough products can get authorized in the pouch space, we can potentially prohibit that from happening. But the warning letters that I'm seeing, in addition to being on new brands I haven't heard of yet, most of it's on foreign product because there's just like such a wider array of flavors and innovation, size formats, different strengths that are coming from abroad. And I think that's a very interesting indicia that like the marketplace is changing. And if FDA doesn't keep up by giving out enough authorizations of these products that people are looking for, people will find them in other
Right.
channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so you mentioned the demand for flavors. The other big news recently was the authorization of the Glas e-cigarettes in blueberry and mango flavor. And I know your product category is more of the pouches, but can you speak to the regulation there and like react to that authorization? And I will note that Zyn was also authorized in flavors too, without seemingly too much of a fuss. So can you talk about maybe the differences there and how regulatory decisions are made with flavors in pouches versus e-cigarettes?
Yeah, I guess at the outset, I'd say when the FDA thinks about inhalable products, the cigarette's somewhat their starting point. And cigarettes, of course, have only been available in a normal tobacco flavor and a menthol style for a very long time. Almost 20 years now, that's been sort of the dynamic. And so I think when the FDA is thinking about e-cigarettes as a substitution for the cigarette, it's kind of dominated by that same menthol tobacco flavor dynamic that they're accustomed to seeing. Um, and I think a lot of individuals, and this can include the FDA, and like, let's remember that you can't actually have a tobacco product on the White Oak campus. It's not like the reviewers of these applications are sampling the products that they're looking at. They have nothing but paper in front of them to make these choices or these decisions. But e-cigarettes, nicotine itself doesn't have a natural tobacco flavor to it. So even in an e-cigarette, a tobacco flavor has to be added, and it's one of the more complex ones to try to develop because it takes a lot of different chemicals to try to replicate the flavor of lighting a cigarette on fire. Menthol a little bit easier,
And that's
but
another, sorry to interrupt, that's another big area of misperceptions too, is that I think people think tobacco is the default flavor. And there was in the Supreme Court case, one of them made a comment about how it has to be flavored like fruit to cover up the taste of tobacco in an e-cigarette. It's like that's not true. And I see a lot of research as
not how any
well
of this
calling
works.
tobacco
Yeah.
unflavored. And like the very term flavored kind of implies that tobacco is non-flavored because that's sort of seen as the default, but it's not. It's also a flavor that has to be added.
Yeah, for any product that is a nicotine-based product, absent a tobacco leaf, all flavors have to be added to that. And a lot of smokers, and this just makes sense anecdotally, right? But I mean, a lot of smokers say, I don't want to taste something that just reminds me of the cigarette, because they enjoy cigarettes. People do, in fact, like smoking. And if they're having trouble letting go of a thing that they like because they know it's bad for them, the last thing they want to remember is something that kind of tastes close to that thing, but not quite. Like, just have the cigarette, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think you saw this with some of the early Juul products where, the mango was a great performer in terms of actually switching adults completely in a relatively short time frame away from cigarettes at all. And so I think the flavors discussion got really complicated because, of course, there is this tobacco control narrative that flavors are designed to hook kids. In fact, flavors are necessary for adult receptivity to the products. And that's why the flavors get added to the products that get added. So Glass is interesting because Glass had age verification technology built in. The idea here being that if you age gate the product in a meaningful way, it reduces the likelihood that minors are going to access it and use it, and that makes it okay for an adult to finally get a flavor. It's problematic for a number of reasons. Number one, cigarettes are analog and they're very easy. You take it out of the pack, you light it on fire, you inhale.
You don't
Back to
need
the
a
demographics
smartphone
of
app to smoke a cigarette.
Yeah, and well, back to the demographics of who is still smoking in this
Right.
country.
Mhm.
Having to have a smartphone that's Bluetooth enabled and that's within pairing range of a device adds a lot of complication to a ritual that's actually pretty simple without any of that going into it. And I think the FDA's focus on the age gating technology, again, completely ignores the fact that we have a universe of cheap flavored disposable options that you just pick up and puff on with no age verification needed. So, I welcome the technology. I welcome the advancements. I welcome adults having authorized legal options. I worry that we have added too much tech to a process for folks that are used to a very analog environment.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I feel the
But
same. I have very mixed feelings because on one hand, it's great that a product met the very high bar of the FDA to allow flavors, and there's clearly a demand for flavors that can't be suppressed by all the regulatory barriers. But at the same time, is this the new norm? Is it reaching everybody that it needs to reach?
yeah, and with pouches, I'd say to the extent that the world of smokeless tobacco or dip is an analog, you have a lot of flavor options in the smokeless world because that category wasn't hit with the same sorts of flavor restrictions that the combustible world was hit with. And so I think it's kind of easier for people to wrap their minds around the idea that, oh, you're going to need these kind of like for like substitutions in this space. But, with that said, I can remember waiting with bated breath on the Zen decision and being worried that the non-menthol, non flavors, because there's no tobacco flavor, they just have like a non-flavor option.
Right.
I was worried that, the more interesting flavor profiles weren't going to get through authorization because the FDA is so focused on the youth issue that
Right.
sometimes they're so focused at the exclusion of the adults these products are intended for. So relieved to see, a relatively small and fairly adult oriented slate. Coffee,
Hmm.
cinnamon, citrus are pretty tame, I think, as far as
Right.
flavors
Right.
go compared to some of what's out there in the universe. But,
Yeah,
would
and
note that,
NYTS results are very favorable to Zyn as well. I think a lot of the tobacco control researchers were expecting a large spike over the last year or two based on the retail sales, but clearly it's predominantly occurring among adults because youth rates have been, like maybe slightly increasing, but not significant year over year. Takes like a couple of years difference to show a significant difference.
yeah, I think there's probably a lot of interesting reasons you can point to as to why it is so different with regard to that age group. Probably, the delivery has something to do with it in
Yeah.
terms of reinforcement and obviously the marketing situation has probably been a little bit different around these products as well. I think Swedish Match was very focused on not taking that kind of criticism and not being seen as like a vehicle for youth access to these products. Even down to, I mean, I know there's a term, Zinfluencer. No one who has ever styled themselves as a Zinfluencer was ever paid by Swedish Match or Philip Morris to talk about the products, which is also fascinating to watch, just to see how big that product got on its own, from just like sort of consumers talking to each other.
Right.
And even within that Zinfluencer community, I find it fascinating because even without an MRTP, which we hope they will get this year maybe, but even without that claim designation, it does seem that people intuitively understand that the pouch is not as bad for you as a cigarette. And I
Hmm.
think with e-cigarettes, whether it was a volley, just like the format with the battery attached to it, a lot more of that was like complicated and unknown, where this is a relatively simple format. And what you see in some of those influencer discussions is like an implicit awareness of harm reduction without that term ever being used.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a kind of a pet peeve of mine in the research that looks at the social media. I have another video on that claimed there was a viral spike on TikTok about Zyn or about pouches and tried to correlate it with sales. And it's like the two are, the one has almost nothing to do with the other because it's a very small proportion of all of TikTok posts, and the time trends don't really align unless you analyze it in the way that they did. But a lot of that's a distinction that I rarely see being made in the literature. A handful of papers do it, but like which influencers were paid to do so, which influencers are just word of mouth. And it seems like for the papers that bother to look at it, it's predominantly word of mouth and people sharing their own experiences to try to help other people. And
Yeah,
it's like
that
you,
is a
you
lot
can't
of it.
regulate that away without like imposing on free speech, right?
Yeah, I mean, no amount of manufacturer restrictions would have eliminated its influencer movement because it was not funded by the manufacturers to begin with.
Right, right,
Yeah, it's interesting because people are just living their lives online now. And I think for a tobacco control movement that's gotten accustomed to spotting industry behavior and, attaching maliciousness to it, this has to be a very confusing new world.
yeah, right. Well, I think that's all the questions I had. That was a really helpful take on current and the history of regulation in the US. Is there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to cover?
No, I guess just like a wait and see on the McCary piece, because obviously there was like a rumor about a week before that he was going to be leaving his role. And then he did leave his role. And like you noted earlier, blamed it on flavors and e-cigarettes. I think it was probably bigger than that. But now we find ourselves back here again, this very familiar narrative of big tobacco exerts undue influence and gets its way in a way that I think long term undermines all the work we do to
Right,
educate
even
on
though
this
the
topic.
science, like he was opposing the science, the FDA scientists supported this, obviously. Yeah,
Yeah, and
it's been
that's
frustrating.
getting lost in this broader discussion. This idea that, well,
Mm.
actually, he overruled experts.
Right, right,
Arguably, the Center for Tobacco Products sees more data on nicotine and tobacco containing products than any other governmental agency in the world. And he was ignoring their recommendation
right,
because, I mean, I think the rumor was that he didn't want this to be his legacy. And I would just point out that the legacy you're choosing is one in which hundreds of thousands of Americans die unnecessarily from cigarette related illnesses. And that is maybe a worse legacy than I authorize a mango glass.
right, right.
So here's to maybe having someone appointed who takes that perspective, that making sure that we eliminate smoking in this country is the primary goal as opposed to eradicating nicotine entirely.
Right. Yeah, yeah, more risk proportionate regulation for sure would be very great.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to talk to you as always.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And where can people find you if they want to follow you?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. On the
You're
on the
on Twitter,
socials.
right?
LinkedIn.
Socials,
Yeah,
LinkedIn. Okay.
I'm on Twitter loosely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.